Alright. Welcome to, we're not really sure what to name it. We're going to call it...
Dust2 podcast?
No, we're not doing Dust2 podcast just yet, but... Double doors. So we're just going to have a quick talk about like the week that we've had here at Cologne. We've had the play in the group stages, and then we're going to have a bit of a look forward to the playoffs, which are coming up later this week. I think, unfortunately, the first place that we should probably start, as it's an NA show, complexity.
Cool.
What do you really say about complexity? Like, it was just really disappointing into the season. Like, even if they got a win, you could try and take some positives from it, but I think it's clearly, like, we had the interview with TC right after they got eliminated. Changes are clearly coming with that team, but yeah, what do you think?
Well, the first thing I would think is, changes are needed. I think I was hopped on like a Dust2 show, I think like a couple months back, and I said that I thought complexity had just peaked. So, this result for them, for me, wasn't exactly disappointing because I kind of have expected this coming for a while. I think it's obvious there's some clear upgrades, especially at the position of Opper. I don't know, I'd hate to be like too critical on any one individual, but I think it says it all that like the most exciting thing about complexity is the insane headlines that just came out of their interviews between Junior and Grimm across the group stage. And even Junior's was pretty taken out of context, but like Grimm's was just like, yep, this is all you have to rely on, is that someone's going to be embarrassed by losing to you. And that in itself is an admission that the project just isn't working the way it's meant to. So, yeah.
I think it's more difficult than just picking up a different opper right now for complexity, because you basically are working with 5 rookies. I think the only guy I would say has experience, or I guess the guys, are Grimm and Floppy. Yeah. So when you have essentially a rookie IGL in Tier 1, you have essentially, because I don't think Junior took too much away from his Fury experience, so pretty much a rookie there, and Fang is the newest of all of them, actually. And then you don't really have a lot of voices that are going to contribute to actually make this team better or to recognize where the faults are. So I think TC is probably very good at working with JT, but I think that enlisting some help from maybe a more seasoned person would be someone to give some just greater perspective, like an Adren type, for example. Even though he's removed from Liquid, I don't know if he'd want to take a complexity role, but if that option were available, I think if you want to just keep the core players, because I think the contracts for these guys is probably pretty good for what complexity, the bang for the buck in terms of media rights that you're getting back, kickbacks from Blast and ESL, and then you're also the sponsorship obligations you're fulfilling by just having the team. You're probably actually making a profit on this team right now, so you don't want to change and keep a guy on your payroll. That's going to upset that balance. So almost like, unfortunately for NA fans, complexity as an org, in terms of the bottom line here, they almost don't have to do anything because you're probably already making a profit. So I think that, but changing or adding one other voice, a consultant type like Adren, or even just making him the coach right now, is the only thing I would be really keen on if I'm just thinking money-wise.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in terms of complexity, like, I think it's pretty obvious that, like, when you're looking at the players individually, like Junior, clearly, I think he has the talent. I think for him, it's just a case of confidence, and like now that's kind of starting to spread to the other players. Like he said in the interview with us, like it just seems like it's in everyone's mind that we can't get a win at the moment. But in terms of Junior, like for you guys, is there any opera in NA off the top of your head you think would actually fit, or do you think they have to go to Europe to like actually get an upgrade in that position to kind of like get some confidence back in the team?
I actually don't know the lower levels of NA super well, so I actually couldn't really pinpoint like a North American opera that I think is up and coming. So that one would be hard. But there's some other operas like out in this is super far fetched. But if you could ever get like an opera like Dexter or something like that, like if you could just go out and say, and especially with like the schedule of NA teams right now, it wouldn't even have to be like a full-time move over to North America, right? Like they spend a lot of time in Europe boot camping. Dexter's pretty far-fetched, but there's got to be like a tier 2 opera somewhere that you could pick up from Europe and put into that team and have practice with the team while he's here. Maybe practice like with High Ping from NA like a couple times, or just kind of do philosophy and training in that sense, and maybe that'd be a way to work around it. But off the top of my head, no, not really an opera that I can think of that I would highlight. You would probably definitely know better than I would.
The only guy that I think might be a better prospect right now is Minus. But I don't think he's actually better than Junior today. I think that it's just that what I know, I've played with him before, and Daps was pretty high on him. Elige put him as his player to watch in the upcoming year. Now he's teamless because he was on Daps's team, which has since folded, and he hasn't gotten a new team since then because he kind of fell apart at a poor time, I think, for him. And unfortunately, right now, I think he's maybe looking at Valorant just a little bit, which, I mean, is understandable if you want to make money. But if everything I've heard and what I know about him is true, then you might build towards having an opper that could supersede Junior as the second best NA opper. But as it stands today, I don't think he would actually provide anything other than being a cheap signing and potential. And then you're working for maybe 6-7 months before he's even at the same speed as Junior. But I think he's gonna like do a couple things better. Like he works really hard. Like I know that. So I know he's like looking at the demos, but I don't know Junior's work ethic necessarily. So I don't know if that's gonna. I'm not trying to slight him with this.
I think too, Maui's point about the coach is pretty important because when I watch Complexity, it's like you know the skills there with Floppy. You know, I mean, I saw Grim and Liquid. He's got hella game, some lack of game understanding certainly, but he's got the talent. I think the biggest issue with Complexity is it never seems when I watch them play like they have an understanding of how to get themselves like good fights or clean fights or comfortable fights or some kind of an advantage in a situation. It just seems. Disconnected gaming at times. So I think having a coach that brings in, even if you go, consultant idea is interesting, Adren as a coach is interesting, even if you went and got like someone from MSL and you were like, hey, work with us like 10 hours a week or work with us, 2 practices a week or something like that. Get like a European voice in there that can help you kind of adapt to the meta and kind of update your game and get it out of like the mire that is North American Counter-Strike and see what these guys can do when they actually start having a few game plans to find some solid fights. Because I think more than anything, the NA scene is suffering from the same thing we suffered from, like 15 years ago after CGS, is just like the entire top level of North American Counter-Strike once again disappeared overnight. Then it was CGS folding and then no one playing Counter-Strike ever again. Now it's obviously Valorant coming out and the NA scene disappearing and everyone's in a different game and you no longer have like the ability, like you no longer have veterans to pass on experience and knowledge to the younger players. So I think getting a more veteran voice in that team that can help them find ways with utility to make these fights more comfortable, because even Fang's drop off is like depressingly surprising. Like he was a player that I was really excited to watch in this Complexity lineup, and he just seems like he's not getting like some of the fights that are happening for him when I watch them play. I'm just like, how is this? He's just entering in through a Molotov or half blind at all times, or the fight just doesn't feel clean in any way. And I think that's more than anything what they're missing within that team.
Like you said there, and maybe a European perspective being brought into that team could bring something different. The other NA team that's here, we obviously had Liquid adding an EU perspective with YEKINDAR. We've heard a lot about him in terms like what he brings to the team. Like he's another voice for Nitro to kind of work alongside, especially like since he was away for so long in Valorant. Maybe he's not fully caught up with meta. Like he's done a good job so far, I think, like considering the time that he spent away. But from Liquid's run here, like they lost to Spirit in the first game, then they came all the way back through the lower bracket with like a lot of close games. What can we kind of say about their performance with YEKINDAR coming in? Like I think they had like 9 days to practice and adding Daps as a coach as well.
I think the biggest thing, YEKINDAR, I mean, obviously, like the conversation that they have about him bringing some like CS ideas is all well and good and great, and I'm fully on board with that. But I think the biggest thing that he's provided is like seemingly a unifying presence within that team, which is, when I was there coaching, I brought Fallen in for the exact same purpose. Like that team was just frayed at the seams. Like they really couldn't find any way to meaningfully and efficiently communicate with each other to get on the same page in terms of their ideas. So having someone like YEKINDAR, who everyone has seemingly like just rallied around and been like, we're going to listen to this guy, he's going to be the one, and he's kind of taken over the attitude in that team, which is a super impressive feat as a stand-in coming in. But I think more than anything, more than any tactics he brings to the team, like that kind of a presence for Liquid is such a huge benefit, because it's exactly what they've needed for, I don't know, probably like their entire existence.
From everything I've gathered so far about YEKINDAR's presence, it does seem like this is finally a player coming into their team that can put forward ideas and not be afraid of being reprimanded. Like he hasn't been blooded yet to know maybe some of the more negative sides of being on Liquid long term. And as it stands, everybody is definitely in a bit of a honeymoon in terms of acceptance, and that's really important for him to be able to feel comfortable, because he does have a more, I'd say, modern style of playing the game. He does know what the top tier players and teams in the CIS region are bringing to the table, and that was incredibly apparent when they played their Cloud9 series. I also think that it's worth giving. It's tough to really quantify what Daps is bringing to this team, but when We talked to Naf actually very recently. He said that what Daps is doing very well is that he's like it's kind of almost like a contrast. What Adren was bringing to Liquid was kind of like bringing the same sort of ideas that they've been using for a long stretch of time, and Daps is bringing slightly different ideas. He's still very agreeable for them, but it's just enough of a shift in perspective that they can at least change and feel refreshed about what they're doing in the server.
Yeah, and just speaking from experience, as Daps coming into that team as a coach, it'll take some time, I think, for his impact to be fully felt. Like, he's still in that kind of like a feeling out phase and how the team is going to operate on top of the entire team philosophy seemingly shifting with YEKINDAR. Like, he's going to be there for that, which is great to have. You know, when I stepped in as a coach, I was like playing catch up on like how they wanted to play, because we weren't exactly trying to change a whole lot at the time. We were still just trying to get everyone working together in some kind of effective and efficient manner, which felt impossible. But with YEKINDAR being there and Daps being there from the go, all of a sudden you have a coach who's going to be acclimated to the style as it's updated, and he's going to be part of that process and know the conversation. So I think it'll just take a little bit longer for Daps' impact to be felt, because certainly the stronger change and the stronger impact is from YEKINDAR.
Obviously, this week when they went through the lower bracket, they had like the grueling like task of going through all those games. Like, they had 2 games on the last day. We clearly saw like a lot of games going 30 rounds, heading to overtime. Like, I think they had 4 against, who was it, Spirit, and then I think they ended up losing it. What can we kind of say about like that in terms of like their mentality? Like, would we see this from the old Liquid with Shocks? Like, do you think that they'd be able to get through those games, or is that something that YEKINDAR's brought, or is it just like now that they have like a better perspective or something like that?
Well, they wouldn't even been in those games with Shocks. I mean, YEKINDAR was fragging out in a couple of them. The Spirit one, he actually didn't do that well, but Cloud9, Furia, I think he did very well.
He had his maps.
Yeah. So I think that if that were just the same Liquid as before, I don't know about mentality speaking, but I just don't think they would have been as good for a lot of different reasons. I think that with players taking, I think like Naf is frequently taking over where Shocks was playing in certain roles, and kind of though just the way that the roles have been divvied since YEKINDAR has slotted in, you basically have a guy that's a top 20 rifler in Naf that's playing support spots and still outputting at a very high level. He's not hitting career record numbers for himself, but just knowing it's a stable force there instead of a guy that's, you know, going to go 1 for 1 or sometimes 0 for 1. Instead, you're getting a guy that, like on Car Dust2, when I forgot who they were playing, but he was like, Naf was just at Car and he aced them. Like, it's just like, if that were Shocks, you're gonna get 1 kill. So I think that's kind of like the trickle down effect of everything improving when you now have a top 10 rifler in YEKINDAR. That's, I think, the biggest change for me, more so than a mentality thing. But you can see, I don't know, you can see in some of those moments they still have just a knack for losing what seems like an unlosable round. So I don't think that necessarily has changed for them just yet. And it should get better, though, because there is some miscommunication with YEKINDAR not recognizing maybe you don't try to flank the whole bomb plant or like the whole diffuser there for Spirit in that close one.
Yeah, I think closing games is like, there's no way to really like practice it. I think it's just something that comes along with time of playing together. So I think that'll change over time, certainly. I don't know. Liquid, even at like their worst and even at their biggest struggles, have always had like a knack for staying in games, even when there's like disaster striking. It's just you never feel like they're going to come out on top, and I think they showed that they can actually have that resilience to actually be able to win those games rather than just play them into close losses, which is certainly a benefit. I'm with Maui. I think Naf is critically important to this team, and I think he's perhaps like in some ways the most important player in this team, just because just as a person. He just goes with the flow. Like, he's a guy, I say this all the time, he just shows up and frags, and he just shows up and plays the game. And he's not too demanding in terms of how he wants to play it, in terms of what he wants to be good. And having like just a rock like that, especially in such an important position, an important role on the team, who's just there to frag out and delivers consistently is massive. So yeah, I certainly think this is the best Liquid that we've seen in a long time. They do have a knack. I noticed a lot of 4v2s they lost throughout this group stage week, like maybe 2 to 3 per game, which is kind of scary, which can't be a thing going forward. But those, again, I think those are issues that are going to get ironed out the more this team plays together. So I don't know. I was making the argument, which is kind of a little bit of copium, but there's some truth to it too, where the more struggles and tribulations this Liquid team went through during the group stage, I think they're going to be better off come playoffs. I think they're going to be better off once they get on the stage against Movistar, and I think they're going to be better off having a chance at an upset over FaZe, which is obviously going to be a super difficult prospect. But I just think that team, as they play more and more, we're going to see those small kinks iron out more and more.
So those were the two teams that we had from North America that were here. It's kind of going to be difficult to like keep this talk going with. We can if you want. I think we've done enough of that on like the podcast and the post show. Like I think our first podcast, like it was like, and it was an hour long. I think it was like 45 minutes of EG. So I think the Dust2 US viewers have probably had enough of us talking about EG for now. But in terms of like from the play-in and the group stage, what was like your most like pleasant surprise? Like it doesn't have to be a team that like massively overperformed, but just for you from like looking at like performances and stuff, like who's kind of like surprised you in a nice way? Like for me, I think it's 0-0 Nation. Like I don't think they put up any particularly impressive results. Like they beat Imperial and they lost a Spirit, and I don't think they got a win in the main group stage. Like they lost FaZe and they lost a Liquid. But I think just from like the sudden turnover to having 3 new players, Taco calling for those guys that like weren't really used to it. From talking to them, they seem like they're like in like a good place, and like I think over this off season they're gonna have like a really good chance to like get to work and like really kind of put something special together, because I think like those 3 young riflers are gonna do great. I think if Cold can kind of get like into a better position in terms of like you're away from the IGLing now, you can focus on yourself, because I think he's been the biggest letdown. But I think if you can get him back into a good place in terms of like just rifling, have Taco calling for him, I think 0-0 Nation could probably put something really special together with the Brazilian scene. But what about you guys?
Yeah, they seem okay. I was happy to see like the 3 young players perform well within that team outside of Cold and Taco. But I'm still at a point with them where the name value of Cold being so disappointing kind of struggles to make me be super excited about them. Especially when you consider, I think they could have probably beat Liquid if Cold was playing at a higher level as well. Not to put it all on him, but I think that lack of Cold's air on that team really kind of hurts them to a certain extent. My biggest surprise, or pleasant surprise, has got to be Movistar Riders. I think that's been an awesome thing to watch happen, and they've been on my radar since I was coaching Liquid, just because my analyst was Hepa, who worked with them in the past as well. So he was kind of cluing me into them and saying this team is like slowly improving, getting better. He was always watching the games and everything as well. So I kind of was pleasantly surprised, especially after their 5-0 EPL run that didn't really turn into anything. But then winning Valencia, coming here and just going through the group stage, that's a really cool like underdog run throughout the group stage. So I like those guys a lot. I like Sampaias a lot. I like Mappas a lot. So I mean that team seems to be a really cool one to talk about. Even their coach is like an interesting story of a former player from the Spanish scene who they've kind of brought on, and he's got complete control of that team. Like they don't really mess with the map vetoes. They don't really mess with like the strategy and the game plan. He just kind of presents them. This is how we're going to play the game. This is what we're going to exploit. These are maps we're going to try and play, and this is why. So I think there's a lot of interesting things about this Movistar team, and I hope it continues. I hope they put up a good show on the stage. It's just a question mark of the experience on a stage like Cologne.
To touch on both of those, 0-0 Nation, I'm actually pretty high on where that team could go. Unfortunately, I think that when you watch them closely, that Lato, despite being a really strong player at times, kind of can be inconsistent, and I think experience is his biggest weakness, or the lack thereof. He frequently just kind of like oversteps. He's supposed to be a space taker, he's supposed to be aggressive, but knowing the difference between too much is something that he's definitely learning the hard way. Cold obviously is a talking point because he's been performing weak, and I think that's going to be something that is also very telling in terms of if he can improve, because 0-0 Nation basically built this roster around him, and that's kind of the scariest part of all of this, because if he's a solid point on it and he knows his contract is guaranteed in some way, then, or he feels untouchable, maybe he doesn't find the motivation to regain that sort of ability that he obviously had before. For Movistar, yeah, I think that right now it's pretty cool to see them peak like this. I feel like this might be them training incredibly hard for Valencia, carrying that into this one. Because when I watch them pretty closely, I think the things that really stand out to me, Sampaias has been pretty good for a while for them, but Mopaz had this really bad drop-off for everything prior to Valencia. He had like a 0.92 rating past 3 months, going into Valencia, and then suddenly he just shot up like really hard. And I kind of wonder how much of their success is they're not setting him up a lot. Like, he's kind of just doing his own thing in these pressure lurker positions, and I don't really know if that's gonna keep up. I hope it regresses to somewhere in between prior to Valencia and where it is now, but I don't know if post player break if we're going to see the same Mopaz that we've seen at Cologne and at Valencia. But that's my only worry for them. I guess I was going to pick Movistar also as my bright spot, so that's where I'd go with that.
Well, we can also, I mean, the other one that's obvious, especially going into the playoffs, is Mouse Sports. I don't know if it's just a pleasant surprise that they're here. I think this is probably the peak we'll see out of Mouse Sports for a while. I don't know if we'll see a result like this quite again, but it's certainly been a cool run. Torji's been awesome with the AWP. If that keeps up, maybe they can get back here. JDC I've really liked as well. The two things that scare me the most about Mouse Sports, obviously, is, like I said, I don't think they can get back here again. And I think tactically, what I saw from them at this event was very one-dimensional. It was very much like, hey, we're going to be spread into default, and then at some point we're going to group up, and we're just going to kind of hit a bomb site as 4 players or as 5 players. And fair play to them, it worked partially by benefit of Torji being such a good clutcher. I think he's the second-rated clutch player, as we saw before this podcast started. He's got like 8 clutches, I think, so far at the event, and also doing a really good job at finding opening picks on T sides as well with the AWP. And if those things don't manifest themselves in the playoffs, I think they're going to be in trouble. But I think all those things combined, I just see this kind of being like a little bit of like a one-trick pony run for Mouz, unfortunately. Do you want to say anything about that?
Nah.
Yeah, I think the thing with Mouz is I think they surprised a lot of people, obviously, but when I got the chance to talk to Torzi after, I can't remember which win, but it was like the one that like put them on the brink of going through. They said like after Dallas, like the thing with JDC, like the replacement of NBK, when he came in, he kind of underwhelmed a lot of people in terms of like the output that he was putting out. Like they thought he would be a big upgrade over MBK, and he was kind of like underwhelming. They said after Dallas, like they were very unhappy with where they were. They had a lot of talks. They changed stuff around that you can kind of clearly see now. For me with Mouz, if they want to get back to this point, this off season has to be like you take your break and then you go straight back to work, and like you try and like actually build on what you have at the moment. Because I think it's going to be easy for them to look at this as like a positive result and say like, oh, we're going to go on our player break. And then you see it so much with teams, like they go into the player break off like a high, and then they come back just completely underwhelming because they think they can like kind of leave, like start where they left off. So I think it's important for Mouz if they do want to continue to like really kind of push on from this after the player break. But I think only time will tell with that, because
I'd say one thing that is working very much so against me believing in Mouz post this event is that they pulled off some crazy ass comebacks. And I think that when I watched some of those games, like against Heroic on Vertigo, against NIP on Inferno, it just looked like the other teams kind of just got complacent and they played not to lose. They just kind of took their foot off the gas. They just were like, all right, we got this one. Like, we're not. And I think people have continuously underrated them, and they're probably not prepping as hard. And I think it's going to be incredibly telling for how Glaive and Astralis prep for Mouz going into the playoffs, because I think they're going to get exposed.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, like you touched on there with the Mouz and Heroic game. The next part that we wanted to talk about was the biggest disappointment, and for me it actually was Heroic, because I think like the 4 players that they have that have been together for like 2 years now, just incredibly consistent. Like, you know that you can get at least like on the brink of a playoffs run or a playoffs run. So I think for me they were the biggest disappointment, because like they did well in the play-in, but clearly you saw them, like you said, take their foot off the gas in like the group stage. Because like a team like that, even if you're replacing just one player, like Refresh with Yabi, like maybe they don't fit all the roles, but you still have enough there in those 4 players, I think, to get that over the line against Mouz. So for me, they were the biggest disappointment, because I really had them locked in for a playoffs run here. And I think like a lot of teams have been disappointing, but just for me, like I think in terms of like the structure that they had there, massive underperformance here at like to finish off the season, like coming last in groups. So what do you think with your biggest disappointment?
I think Heroic's got to be there. I think you're right on that one. I mean, certainly, especially the way they go out, like I said, losing to such a huge upset to Mouz and last place in groups is brutal. But I mean, shit, you could take your pick of the litter at this event, like G2, Vitality, Heroic, and Big to a certain extent, although I never know what to think of Big, so I don't know how disappointed I can ever actually be in them. Yeah, I don't know. It's been a weird event in that sense. I expected like one of G2 or Vitality to go through the playoffs. I didn't think it would be both. So that part kind of sucked. But Heroic is probably the biggest name in the fashion of which they dropped out and how early it occurred, where you're just like, oh God. NIP, has got to be a huge disappointment as well, considering coming into this event and their first games in the group stage was like, okay, we're in, like we're bought in now, like this team looks good, the calling looked great, Hampus was having those blowout games, the T sides were clinical, and then to watch them drop out at the very end against Mouz was super disappointing. Like right when you start to believe, they just kind of let you down. But I mean, really at this event, there's like 6 teams, depending on which angle you want to take, that you can be incredibly disappointed in.
Cloud9. Nafany.
Yeah, I didn't even mention Cloud9. We didn't even get there.
Yeah. I mean, that was incredibly poor. Both their Astralis series and their Liquid series didn't even look really that competitive. They were not playing to what we saw at Dallas. Even 80% of that. Yeah. It was like 65% of Dallas Cloud9. So that's not a great sign for them, because it's clear that this team is still volatile in terms of where they are and what you can expect of them. Every event, you don't know anymore. Major, they lose to Imperial, and they basically lost to Astralis in the same fashion. Like, they kind of just kept walking into ops and dying and dying and dying. And then I already went hard on Nafany on the desk about choosing to double op T side against Liquid, and then just like everything was working in the game plan, and then suddenly you just decide to change up the strat entirely. So I think too much of the strategies hinge on Nafany kind of getting his openers, and I think also I've said it for like a while now that I just don't think this style is sustainably going to get you into the playoffs, because if you have 2 players, Axel and Shiro, who are vying for top 5 in the world consistently, statistically, how are you not making it to every playoffs? That's kind of sad, and it's kind of shows that they're less than the sum of their parts. So I think my biggest disappointment is Cloud9, because I thought I wanted Cloud9 to do so well at this event, because I wanted them to bring in a third possible contender for this one. If they were able to replicate the Dallas form and how they beat FaZe at that was the most exciting series I've seen all year, is FaZe Cloud9 at Dallas. And to be robbed of that on a stage again, like you just don't know what you're gonna get from them. And I kind of like have this love-hate with them when they're clicking. They can beat anybody, but they're really the highest variance team for me. Like, some people say, oh, they could beat anybody but lose to anybody. I think that team is Cloud9 now for me.
Yeah, and I think Shiro and Axel were even like top 5 at the event itself when they eventually lost. Like, it wasn't even just contending for top 5 in the world for the year. It was like you had 2 players that were like of the 5 best players at this event, or let's just say 10 best players to be safe. Like, that should get you into the playoffs just by that virtue alone.
So in terms of the playoffs themselves, we have Movistar and Liquid and Mouz versus Astralis. With those like 4 teams being like before this event, like I don't think many of us would have those 4 teams being here, if like any of them. What can we kind of say about those games and like how we think that they might go, despite how like kind of volatile they are in terms of like the way the teams have been forming?
I think, Liquid, you probably could have made an argument to be in the playoffs. I kind of had them like 50-50 for playoffs. I had them like knocking on the door of getting in before this event, and obviously the X factor was what they were going to look like. But for the matchup specifically, I think the biggest point in both Mouz Astralis and Liquid Movistar is going to be experience versus inexperience. In the sense that, I mean, obviously for Mouz and Movistar, this is like the first stage they'll be in of this caliber, and the game changes massively, not just for like the pressure and the environment that it puts on you, but even just like the small details of the way the game is played, the tricks you can kind of have on LAN to get little pieces of information that we know the experienced players do, and just the willingness to play the same way that you did in the group stage, right? The willingness to be aggressive and take space, the willingness to be aggressive and risk your life to go find that pick or go find that lurk kill. Those are things that we normally see like the inexperienced players shy away from a little bit more due to the pressure of the moment. I think both of them certainly have upset potentials, because I mean, we know Astralis can certainly suck. We know Liquid can certainly drop the ball. So I mean, there's upset potential in both of those games, but I think Liquid and Astralis certainly going to be going into those as kind of heavy favorites just based on experience alone.
Yeah, the experience factor is where I do give the edge to Astralis and Liquid in this. I would definitely bet on them to go through, but I would say that I'm more likely would expect the Movistar upset than the Mouz upset. I think the Mouz, yeah, okay. Four of those guys on Mouz have never played on a stage. Like, the only guy you can rely on would be Frozen to deliver, but the thing is that I just have no idea what I'm going to get from Torzy. Whereas the least experienced player for Astralis wasn't even playing well at this event in Far League. So it's not like they were relying on Far League to do so much work for them. It was Blame F and Config and Zip, actually, who were doing well. And those guys have so much more stadium experience. So I don't think they're going to drop off. I think that the time between the group stage playoffs is going to help Astralis tremendously and much more than Mouz. Whereas the Movistar game, I'm kind of just worried because they, even though it was just a kind of a DreamHack event, ESL Challenger Valencia, there was a sizable enough audience that they at least know what it's like for there to be a crowd and for there to be like those sounds and like the speakers and everything. They've done it recently. So the scale of Cologne is so much bigger that you can't go 1-to-1, but it's like 1-to-1.8 or something. You know, it's something where I can believe in them drawing off of that experience and saying, okay, we've at least felt a little bit of that emotion before. We felt the shakes and we've calmed down. So let's do it. Let's do it again. And I think that the thing is that I don't know if you want to move into the semis, but I mean, I just think that it's such heavy favorites though going into the semis. So yeah.
That's actually the next part that I was going to touch on. Is there any team out of those four that have a reasonable possibility of stopping a FaZe or a Navi?
Liquid's the only one.
Yeah.
Liquid's the only one. I don't think they can stop Navi, but I think FaZe is a beatable opponent still. Not that I think FaZe is weak in any way. I mean they're going to be overwhelming favorites when you look at all the factors, such as, I mean, obviously this team with all the trophies they've won this year. The map pool is certainly going to favor FaZe to no end, especially with how deep they've tried to make it. But I do think there's this quality of FaZe, and I thought it might kick in at the major, and it obviously didn't. But, you know, even you remember FaZe during this run of when they've won all these big events, they've played some very close affairs. They've had to come back in a lot of games. They've showed up flat and kind of had to dig themselves out of holes in a few of these big games, especially look back at Katowice. Pro League, they had one against ENCE as well. So, I mean, there's a tendency there, and I think Liquid going into that match is going to have kind of obviously the new look, the new style. If that feels a little bit more ironed out, that could catch FaZe a little bit off guard. And FaZe, more so than Navi, is going to be a much more comfortable style, that explosive style that FaZe has versus the more like slow-paced, lurky, like CIS influence of Navi. I think Liquid is going to be way, way more comfortable in that matchup than they would be against a Navi. So it's still unlikely, and we'll see how they start to play in the quarterfinals to like make that final determination. But I think Liquid over FaZe is like 10 times more likely to happen than Astralis taking on Navi.
Yeah.
I think you nailed that. I don't think there's any way I could see Astralis beating Navi. Yeah. But Liquid, I
you have a Liege go off on a map, you have like fucking YEKINDAR go off on a map, like they get one map upset and then you just win one map clean by like tactics or by like a close affair, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I would probably think Liquid could have win a Dust2. Actually, I think their Dust2 has looked phenomenal at this one so far, especially because OC is playing so well right now. But that's another thing where, I don't know, OC on a stage, we haven't seen that one yet, and he was instrumental in some of their victories. But I think he could do it, especially given the fact that he'd have warmed up in the quarterfinals already.
Yeah. I think, too, Overpass might be an interesting map in that veto, a map that, like, FaZe tried to, like, kind of work on during the Roubat Cup to deepen their pool, a map that Liquid wanted to pick coming into this event and got battered on it and scared away from it, but they've had to put more focus on it. So I think if you're Liquid and you want to go into the veto and throw a little bit of a wrench in the work, just say, look, we're going to test our new look Overpass against your new look Overpass, and, like, that's maybe, who knows what could come out there.
Like you kind of touched on at the start as well, like with YEKINDAR as like kind of like that X factor. We said that, like, he has his maps, like he hasn't been super consistent over it. If he has one of those maps against FaZe, I think in terms of like the names that are on the server, like I think the Liquid kind of match up pretty well with them, like in terms of like if the players hit their form. But I think it's going to be a tough one because, like you said as well, like FaZe at the major, FaZe at Katowice, like they had those long games where they were trying to like close it out and they were getting those wins in overtime. We've seen Liquid here have those deep overtime games, so I think it's just going to be like a really good series in general in terms of like the matches that we actually get. But
it could also be a blowout.
It could be. It genuinely could be. That's the thing about this tournament as well. Is it has been so unpredictable. Like with the teams that are here in the playoffs, the way that the games have kind of gone in the group stages, and especially when you get to that stage, it's just going to be a completely different ball game for a lot of teams. But the last thing that I was going to ask would be dark horse to win. But are we all on board with Liquid or?
I mean, if you're going to go for like a dark horse from the playoff, It would have to be Liquid. Not that I think there's any kind of crazy real chance to get excited about for a dark horse run, but I think that's the only one I could see in any way that you could even make an argument for.
It's a 2-horse race here.
There's no dark horses. They're all light horses.
Only the horses that are favorites to win. But yeah, I think that kind of pretty much wraps it up. Like, we've had a look at the play in the group stages, the NA Hopium, but yeah, like that's kind of been it from me. If you guys have any signing off thoughts about this tournament in general, or
nothing crazy. I just am happy to be back in Cologne. This is like a marquee event. This is like the unofficial major of the Counter-Strike circuit. So I think this is a cool way to end the season, and perhaps even the last time we'll be able to end a Counter-Strike season at Cologne with all the changes that might be coming next year.
Yeah, I mean, I've yet to taste the arena here, but this is my first.
Tastes good, baby.
This is my first Cologne. I'm excited to work the playoffs. I wish there were a German team though.
yeah, German organization and Mouz. I think that's as close as we were getting after Big got knocked out, but that's all we can kind of claim. But yeah, that's been it from us here. Looking forward to the playoffs and looking forward to seeing Liquid lift a trophy in Cologne. So
Dust2 Double Doors podcast.
Double doors.
Double Doors podcast.